here. And it's a pleasure to speak here at the Hertie School in its new building, and it's an honor to appear together with Gesine Schwan. I am going to make a few historical remarks in preparation, in a way, of the keynote speech she will give afterwards. Post-Demokratia, Post-Democracy is the title of a skeptical assessment of the present situation by the political scientist Colin Crouch. It just appeared in German this year. It criticizes the state of Western democracy. While elections take place and representative bodies work, the substance of democracy is undermined, according to him, by the power of professional experts, PR experts, in and between the campaigns, but also by the apathy of the majority, which, as he says, just reacts to signals. Also by the non-public character of many decisions taking place behind closed doors, and by the tremendous influence of lobbies, particularly business, while labor has gone down. Now, listening to a few of the introductory statements before, I think that both Professor Barber and Professor Offe share some of the skeptical assessments of the present situation, at least with respect to public space, but more than that. It's interesting that Colin Crouch compares the present situation with a situation some decades ago, in which he thinks democracy worked better. He speaks of democratic moments, which he thinks occurred in North America and most of Western Europe around 1950, around the middle of the 20th century. And one might perhaps add, without getting him wrong, in the 50s and 60s. Before then, a period of decline started in the 70s, though not everywhere. As you know, Portugal and Spain experienced democratization only then. In these 30 minutes which I have, I shall try out two arguments. First, I present some evidence on the history of discussion. They are meant to point out that Colin Crouch may not be altogether wrong. Secondly, I talk about civil society from a historical perspective, and this will not fully support Crouch's skepticism. If there is time, and I hope there is, I will try to relate these two topics to the notion of public space. In my discipline, history, statements are usually rather space-specific and time-specific. I will use some German evidence as my starting point, and I am interested in change over time. So first on discussion. Those students and intellectuals and middle-class youngsters who carried in the late 1960s the radical reform and protest movement inside and outside the universities, saw themselves in sharp contrast to the preceding decade, to the 1950s, which they considered as quiet and restorative. Recent historical research is correcting this self-perception of the 68ers, which has been continued in collective memory and in much of the literature. It is now increasingly understood that in many ways the dynamics of the 60s were just a continuation of changes of the 50s, which after all were much less quiet and static than frequently held. Most recently, the Berlin historian Nina Verheyen, in a still unpublished dissertation, has convincingly made this point with respect to the history of discussion. Under discussion, she understands the oral exchange of arguments related to controversial topics, both in the public and in the private spheres. With new evidence, she makes clear that the period from the late 40s and to the early 70s was a period in which discussion, understood as a specific mode of communication, experienced a dramatic rise which restructured the public sphere. Certainly the 68ers were responsible for giving this long-term process a specific twist. They fought for deregulating discussions, away from strict rules and, for instance, away from moderators, herrschaftsfrei. And they abandoned the boundaries of discussion, both in terms of time, endless meetings, and in terms of subjects. Very private decisions were to become objects of open discussion in certain communities. And they re-emphasized hard controversy and despised conversation as a bourgeois performance without substance. And in that they returned to older patterns, older German traditions. But at the same time, the 68ers just continued and, in a way, radicalized the remarkable upgrading and intensification of discussion, so typical for West Germany in the late 40s, 50s, 60s. This was a period when the concept discussion became a positively associated household word in the German language, which it hadn't been before. For the first time, as quantitative semantic analysis shows. It was a period in which numerous fora, institutions of public discussion emerged. Academies of the churches, weekly panels in communal institutions and theaters and schools, Stätten der Begegnung, places of encounters, discussion panels in the radio and in the TV, with Werner Höfer's International Press Club as the most spectacular example. It was a period when discursive practices gained ground in the schools and in the methods of teaching and in the self-representation of the political actors, also in the counseling manuals which gave advice as to good practice in business or in family or in career building. Increasingly, discussion got to be seen as a central element of practiced democracy and civilized life. Now, the underlying reasons for this change were manifold. On the one hand, there were some older German traditions which were rediscovered after the Nazi period. On the other hand, this move towards discussion was seen as something new, by which a new generation of intellectuals, scholars, and youngsters would try to distinguish itself from the parents' and the grandparents' generation, and by which a new Germany, as a parliamentary democracy, could set itself apart explicitly and critically from its dictatorial past under National Socialism, and at the same time from the emerging dictatorship east of the River Elbe. The influence of US-influenced re-education programs shouldn't be underestimated. In those re-education programs, discussion was a central element. to be taught, praised, and institutionalized, and not without effect. But there was more to this rising passion for discussion. It had something to do with rising living standards and with the reshuffling of the social structure in which mobility, also upward mobility, was intensive and in which old milieus eroded. After all, one can learn how to discuss outside one's own family, whereas more traditional modes of communication, for instance, the educated, cultured, playful conversation, are usually products of family-based socialization and in this sense exclusive, especially in bürgerliche, bourgeois milieus. And clearly discussion as an increasingly accepted mode of communication served different social purposes as well. It was not only a way of finding truth or of reaching consensus through criticism and controversy. It was also a strategy for achieving status, recognition, and perhaps cultural superiority. A strategy then, at that time, more available to males than to women, more available to educated middle-class persons than to non-educated, less educated persons from other milieus, more available to the versatile young than to most of the older generations. As a mode of discussion, as a mode of communication, discussion is relatively open and relatively democratic, but nevertheless it tended to marginalize those who could not or didn't want to keep up. In a way, we can see these 2.5 decades as a democratic moment, to use the language of Colin Crouch. It restructured it helped to restructure public space and private life by perforating the borderlines between both. But in a way it did not really continue. Yes, it's true, discussion continues to be ubiquitous today. And in a way, normal, selbstverständlich, obvious, in the talk shows of the media, in political life, in the schools. But in the mid-70s, at the latest, some disappointment set in. Too much had been expected from the problem-solving and civilizing and democratizing power of discussion. Expectations too utopian, too high. Survey data used in this study, which I quote, show that as to the quest for more discussion, something like a point of saturation was reached in the mid-1970s. Now youth cultures emerged which turned away from the discursive mood of their predecessors. The language changed. Discourses segmented, perhaps became more commercialized or more impregnated by experts. It would probably be wrong to speak of decline, but as to the trust in the power of discussion, as to discursive practices, as to discussion cultures, the present time now differs strongly from this breakthrough period of the 50s and 60s about which I shortly spoke. At least this is my impression, and I pose it as a question to those who may know more in terms of social science data about the present time than I. So the pattern of historical change appears to be very different, and now I come to my second part, with respect to what I want to speak about now, the rise of civil society, Zivilgesellschaft, Société civile. This concept is old, with different shades of meaning and with different wording. It has been a central concept of political thought and discourse ever since Aristotle. It was in the era of 18th century Enlightenment that it acquired much of its modern meaning and its basic pathos, thrust, which make it still interesting today. Stressing the autonomous self-regulation of citizens who pursue their particular purposes, but with some regard to the public good, individual and in self-organized cooperation, ready for conflict but non-violent, under the rule of law, related to but different from the emerging market economies, distinguished from government and the state, but related to government and the state through discussions and discourses, through representation and other forms of active participation in the public space. Later on in the 19th century, this concept was redefined and basically relativized by authors like Hegel and Marx under the impact of capitalism and industrialization, I would say, and moved into the direction of meaning bürgerliche Gesellschaft, bourgeois society rather. Towards the end of the 19th century and during most of the 20th century, the concept was marginalized and virtually disappeared, some important exceptions notwithstanding, like Gramsci. But the concept has experienced a remarkable comeback since the 1980s, in English, in German, and other languages, frequently with explicit reference to its 18th century Enlightenment tradition. It has become a widely used concept, both in public and political discourse, as well as in the social sciences and even history. It may be less prominent now, in 2008, than it was in the 1990s, but it continues to be attractive, both as a descriptive or analytical category in some disciplines, and as a semantic icon behind which different authors and different speakers and actors assemble and pursue different goals. It stands, as everybody knows, on the one hand for voluntary unpaid work and engagement, initiatives, networks, associations, movements, and organizations in the space between the polity, the market, and private life, borderlines being fuzzy and always debated. But it also stands, on the other hand, for a type of social action which is in a way typical for this space and which is characterized by a logic, if I may say so, a logic different from the logic of the market and from the logic of government and bureaucracies. It's a type of social action defined by autonomy and self-organization, by non-violence, by orientation towards public discourse, including conflict, compromise, and agreement, frequently related to some general concerns and something like the common good, although, of course, different actors differ as to what constitutes the common good in a particular moment. So, how can one account for this late career of an old concept? First, dissenting authors within East Central Europe played an important role. Geremek, Havel, Georgi Konrad may not have used the concept so much when they wrote in their own languages opposing Soviet hegemony and dictatorial rule in the 1980s. But in the communication between them and Western sympathizers like John Keane or Arato or Dahrendorf, this concept, civil society, became a way of translation, became popular as a post-Marxist code for a non-dictatorial, liberal, democratic, participatory order with a lot of public space, full of individual freedom, some solidarity, and rule of law. There were other roots too in Latin American and South African movements of the left in the 1980s. In other words, civil society became attractive again in the relatively victorious struggles against dictatorships which after all had represented the clearest negation of civil society in the 20th century. But secondly, in the non-dictatorial Western world, the term suited a general political and intellectual climate in the 1990s and in the beginning of this century, at least in three respects. First, the concept, as I said, emphasizes social self-organization and individual responsibility. And in that it seemed very compatible with a widespread skepticism towards being overregulated, spoon-fed by the state. Many have believed that the interventionist state has reached its limit by regulating too much and by becoming overburdened by that. Secondly, the concept civil society as used by, for instance, by present-day anti-globalization movements promises not only an alternative to state action, but also an alternative to capitalist structures, an alternative to the aggressive and unbridled and unregulated, expansive capitalism to be observed worldwide. Thus, the term reflects a new kind of capitalism critique, since the logic of civil society, as I describe it, as determined by public discourse and conflict and agreement, promises solutions different from those of the logic of the market, based on competition, on calculated interest and exchange, and on the maximization of individual benefits. And thirdly, civic involvement, efforts to achieve civic involvement certainly includes efforts to achieve common goals, and this is central to civil society, no matter how differently these goals may be defined. And in the greatly individualized and partly fragmented societies of the recent and present time, civil society promises an answer to the pressing question of what holds our societies together. It is this mixture of anti-statist anti-capitalist and communitarian elements which made the concept so congenial to the intellectual climate of the last 2 decades. And this melange of elements differed clearly and differs clearly from speaker to speaker, from the social democratic moderate left to neoliberal critiques of the welfare state. One wonders, I wonder, what the present crisis of financial capitalism and the apparently accepted powerful return of state regulation will do to this intellectual climate in which civil society could rise conceptually and programmatically. So, the impact of East Central Europe, the correspondence between the meaning of civil society and this intellectual climate. But thirdly, there's a third level on which the observable rise of civil society as a concept and of a program can be explained, and I am speaking of real history. In Germany, like in most other Western and other countries, manifestations of civil society have existed over the centuries. As middle-class bürgerliche associations and clubs, as communal organizations and neighborhood networks, as church-related and other foundations, Stiftungen, but also in the 19th and early 20th century labor movement and in women's and other social movements. Of course, detailed definitions differ and matter once it comes to the measurement of civil society frequency. But all surveys now show, in contrast to Putnam's thesis of bowling in, bowling alone, all show for this country and for other European countries that civil society organizations and activities have grown and spread in the last decades, and that holds true both for traditional ones in social work, philanthropy, church-related activities, as well as to relatively new forms like NGOs, Transparency International, working on a transnational level, or new forms of neighborhood initiatives and networks, or new forms of citizens' foundations, Bürgerstiftungen. It's true. Participation in civil society activities is unevenly spread. Middle-class persons are more likely to participate than lower-class persons. Education counts, so does age. Rural areas are less involved than urban ones. It's also true, one has to admit, that the category civil society is a mixed bag and includes phenomenon of great variety. And frequently, in Germany particularly, such civil society organizations depend more on state support than would be compatible with the ideal of self-organized civil society. And of course, the relation between particular interests and civil society rhetoric can be very problematic, as we not only know from the debate on corporate social responsibility. Still, taken all together, the resources needed by civil society, for civil society activities, have tremendously grown, expanded over the last 100 years in our part of the world. Education, income and some basic material wealth, information, also the technologies of self-organization. Motivations differ, but they have not dried out. And opportunities for non-market and non-government actions have certainly not been reduced, but grown given the problems of market-based relations and sometimes government-based solutions. And such opportunities could be developed further. By and large, the story of civil society in the last years and decades is a story of success, though moderate, unbalanced, and within limits. There are much more implications to this than I can now deal with. It's true there is a lot civil society cannot achieve per se. It presupposes a strong state. It's not a trade-off. It's not a zero-sum game. It presupposes a strong state, including a strong social welfare state. And it presupposes a functioning market economy. At least it's much more likely to emerge once you have a functioning market society in historical comparison. And it presupposes a decentralized structure of power. And as examples from the Weimar Republic seem to show, civil society organizations are not immune against being instrumentalized for very non-civil purposes. Civil society is pluralistic in itself and fragmented in itself, and for reaching and implementing decisions, political mechanisms are needed, not provided for by civil society. So no reason to glorify civil society. Still, if one looks on the phenomenon from a long-term perspective, the rise of civil society may be the most important reason why the present situation should not be qualified as post-democratic. Because these institutions and practices offer a lot of new forms and old forms for participation of all kind, for engaging oneself beyond strictly personal and private purposes, for experiencing some kind of common ground, for developing ties with others, beyond the family sphere and the merely private sphere. And perhaps even a chance to experience some difference, although difference remains limited within the spheres of civil society. So, I've come to the end. I spoke about discussion as a mode of communication. And I spoke about civil society as a space, as a social space, and as a type of social action, including many cultural dimensions. Clearly, discussion and civil society have been allies most of the time. In the 50s and 60s, the movement, which we have discussed so much in this year, the 68ers, can well be seen perhaps as a push forward on the way towards civil society. And civil society mechanisms bring people together beyond strictly private individual circles. But the relation to public space is not that clear. Discussion, yes, very clearly. There is a built-in drive towards a broad notion of public space, breaking down, as I tried to show, the line of distinction between private and public sometimes. A trend towards politicization, certainly. Civil society, on the other hand, can be much more limited if we use Professor Barber's definition of public space, which he presented before. public space needing, public space defined by the fact that there is some stranger and perhaps even some opponent. Many civil society activities do not really include strangers and enemies. So in this sense, the public space related to many civil society activities is rather limited. Take a bowling club, for instance. Still, it's not private, and it's not individual either. So, and this is my last contribution to your general debate, maybe if you think this through, if you continue this line of argument, you need to get away from a dichotomic categorization between private and public. Maybe we should have a more gradualized pattern of thought which distinguishes different spaces according to different degrees of public relatedness, different spectrum, so to speak, with private on the one hand and public space in the full sense of the word on the other. Maybe we need this notion of an intermediate space as to public and private, neither fully private nor fully public. This then would perform some functions, as which Klaus Offe spelled out with respect to democracy, not all. It would certainly help to become active and participating in causes beyond oneself as an individual and private person. But it would not help to make accountable the rulers of the system as a whole. So maybe such a notion of a semi-public and semi-private space can be of relevance to the analysis of the present time, and this is a suggestion I might have for the discussion in the next 2 days. Thank you.